Dread. There is no delight the equal of dread. If it were possible to sit invisible between two people on any train, in any waiting room or office, the conversation overheard would time and again circle on that subject. Certainly the debate might appear to be about something entirely different. The state of the nation, idle chat about death on the roads, the rising price of dental care. But strip away the metaphor, the innuendo, and there, nestling at the heart of the discourse, is dread. While the nature of God and the possibility of eternal life go undiscussed, we happily chew over the minutiae of misery. The syndrome recognizes no boundaries. In bathhouse and seminar room alike, the same ritual is repeated. With the inevitability of a tongue returning to probe a painful tooth, we come back and back and back again to our fears, sitting to talk them over with the eagerness of a hungry man before a full and steaming plate. While he was still at university, and afraid to speak, Stephen Grace was taught to speak of why he was afraid. In fact, not simply to talk about it, but to analyze and dissect his every nerve ending, looking for tiny terrors. In this investigation, he had a teacher, Quaid. It was an age of gurus. It was their season. In universities up and down England, young men and women were looking east and west for people to follow like lambs. Steve Grace was just one of many. It was his bad luck that Quaid was the Messiah he found. They'd met in the student common room. "The name's Quaid," said the man at Steve's elbow at the bar. "Oh, you're Steve Grace?" "Yes. You're in the ethics class, right?" "Right." "I don't see you in any of the other philosophy seminars or lectures." "It's my extra subject for the year. I'm on the English literature course. I just couldn't bear the idea of a year in the Old Norse classes." "So you plumped for ethics?" "Yes." Quaid ordered a double brandy. He didn't look that well off, and a double brandy would have just about crippled Steve's finances for the next week. Quaid downed it quickly and ordered another. "What are you having?" Steve was nursing half a pint of lukewarm lager, determined to make it last an hour. "Nothing for me." "Yes, you will." "I'm fine." "Another brandy and a pint of lager for my friend." Steve didn't resist Quaid's generosity. A pint and a half of lager in his unfed system would help no end in dulling the tedium of his oncoming seminars on Charles Dickens as a social analyst. He yawned just to think of it. "Somebody ought to write a thesis on drinking as a social activity." Quaid studied his brandy a moment, then downed it. "Or as oblivion," he said. Steve looked at the man. Perhaps 5 years older than Steve's 20, the mixture of clothes he wore was confusing. Tattered running shoes, cords, a gray-white shirt that had seen better days, and over it a very expensive black leather jacket that hung badly on his tall, thin frame. The face was long and unremarkable, the eyes milky blue, and so pale that the colors seemed to seep into the whites, leaving just the pin-pricks of his irises visible behind his heavy glasses. Lips full, like a jagger, but pale, dry, and unsensual. Hair a dirty blonde. Quaid, Steve decided, could have passed for a Dutch dope-pusher. He wore no badges. They were the common currency of a student's obsessions, and Quaid looked naked without something to imply how he took his pleasures. Was he a gay, feminist, save-the-whale campaigner, or a fascist vegetarian? What was he into, for God's sake? "You should have been doing Old Norse," said Quaid. "Why?" "They don't even bother to mark the papers on that course," said Quaid. Steve hadn't heard about this. Quaid droned on. "They just throw them all up into the air, face up an A, face down a B." Oh, it was a joke. Quaid was being witty. Steve attempted a laugh, but Quaid's face remained unmoved by his own attempt at humor. "You should be in Old Norse," he said again. "Who needs Bishop Berkeley, anyhow? Or Plato? Or... It's all shit." "Yes. I've watched you in the philosophy class." Steve began to wonder about Quaid. "You never take notes, do you?" "No." "I thought you were either sublimely confident or you simply couldn't care less." "Neither. I'm just completely lost." Quaid grunted and pulled out a pack of cheap cigarettes. Again, that was not the done thing. You either smoked Gauloise, Camel, or nothing at all. "It's not true philosophy they teach you here," said Quaid with unmistakable contempt. "Oh?" "We get spoon-fed a bit of Plato, or a bit of Bentham. No real analysis. It's got all the right markings, of course. It looks like the beast. It even smells a bit like the beast to the uninitiated." "What beast?" "Philosophy. True philosophy. It's a beast, Stephen, don't you think?" "I hadn't—" "It's wild. It bites." He grinned, suddenly vulpine. "Yes, it bites," he replied. Oh, that pleased him. Again for luck. "Bites." Stephen nodded. The metaphor was beyond him. "I think we should feel mauled by our subject." Quaid was warming to the whole subject of mutilation by education. "We should be frightened to juggle the ideas we should talk about." "Why?" "Because if we were philosophers worth, we wouldn't be exchanging academic pleasantries. We wouldn't be talking semantics, using linguistic trickery to cover the real concerns." "What would we be doing?" Steve was beginning to feel like Quaid's straight man, except that Quaid wasn't in a joking mood. His face was set. His pin-prick irises had closed down to tiny dots. "We should be walking close to the beast, Steve, don't you think? Reaching out to stroke, pet it, milk it." What is the beast?" Quaid was clearly a little exasperated by the pragmatism of the inquiry. "It's the subject of any worthwhile philosophy, Stephen. It's the things we fear, because we don't understand them. It's the dark behind the door." Steve thought of a door, thought of the dark. He began to see what Quaid was driving at in his labyrinthine fashion. Philosophy was a way to talk about fear. "We should discuss what's intimate to our psyches," said Quaid. "If we don't, we risk—" Quaid's loquaciousness deserted him suddenly. "What?" Quaid was staring at his empty brandy glass, seeming to will it to be full again. "Want another?" said Steve, praying that the answer would be no. "What do we risk?" Quaid repeated the question. "Well, I think if we don't go out and find the beast—" Steve could see the punchline coming. "Sooner or later the beast will come and find us." There is no delight the equal of dread, as long as it's someone else's. Casually, in the following week or two, Steve made some inquiries about the curious Mr. Quaid. Nobody knew his first name. Nobody was certain of his age, but one of the secretaries thought he was over 30, which came as a surprise. His parents, Cheryl had heard him say, were dead. Killed, she thought. That appeared to be the sum of human knowledge where Quaid was concerned. "I owe you a drink," said Steve, touching Quaid on the shoulder. He looked as though he'd been bitten. "Brandy?" "Thank you." Steve ordered the drinks. "Did I startle you?" "I was thinking." "No philosopher should be without one." "On what?" "Brain." They fell to talking. Steve didn't know why he'd approached Quaid again. The man was 10 years his senior and in a different intellectual league. He probably intimidated Steve, if he was to be honest about it. Quaid's relentless talk of beasts confused him, yet he wanted more of the same. More metaphors, more of that humorless voice telling him how useless the tutors were, how weak the students. In Quaid's world there were no certainties. He had no secular gurus and certainly no religion. He seemed incapable of viewing any system, whether it was political or philosophical, without cynicism. Though he seldom laughed out loud, Steve knew there was a bitter humor in his vision of the world. People were lambs and sheep, all looking for shepherds. Of course, these shepherds were fictions, in Quaid's opinion. All that existed in the darkness outside the sheepfold were the fears that fixed on the innocent mutton, waiting, patient as stone, for their moment. Everything was to be doubted, but the fact that dread existed. Quaid's intellectual arrogance was exhilarating. Steve soon came to love the iconoclastic ease with which he demolished belief after belief. Sometimes it was painful when Quaid formulated a watertight argument against one of Steve's dogmas. But after a few weeks, even the sound of the demolition seemed to excite. Quaid was clearing the undergrowth, felling the trees, raising the stubble. Steve felt free. Nation, family, church, law, all ash, all useless, all cheats and chains and suffocation. There was only dread. I fear, you fear, we fear, Quaid was fond of saying. He, she, or it fears. There's no conscious thing on the face of the world that doesn't know dread more intimately than its own heartbeat. One of Quaid's favorite baiting victims was another philosophy and English lit student, Cheryl Fromm. She would rise to his more outrageous remarks like fish to rain, and while the two of them took knives to each other's arguments, Steve would sit back and watch the spectacle. Cheryl was, in Quaid's phrase, a pathological optimist. "And you're full of shit," she'd say when the debate had warmed up a little. "So who cares if you're afraid of your own shadow? I'm not. I feel fine." She certainly looked it. Cheryl Fromm was wet dream material, but too bright for anyone to try making a move on her. "We all taste dread once in a while," Quaid would reply to her, and his milky eyes would study her face intently, watching for her reaction, trying, Steve knew, to find a flaw in her conviction. "I don't." "No fears? No nightmares?" "No way. I've got a good family. I don't have any skeletons in my closet. I don't even eat meat, so I don't feel bad when I drive past a slaughterhouse. I don't have any shit to put on show. Does that mean I'm not real?" "It means," Quaid's eyes were snake slits, "it means your confidence has something big to cover." "Back to nightmares." "Big nightmares." "Be specific. Define your terms." "I can't tell you what you fear." "Tell me what you fear, then." Quaid hesitated. "Finally," he said, "it's beyond analysis." "Beyond analysis, my ass." That brought an involuntary smile to Steve's lips. Cheryl's ass was indeed beyond analysis. The only response was to kneel down and worship. Quaid was back on his soapbox. "What I fear is personal to me. It makes no sense in a larger context. The signs of my dread, the images my brain uses, if you like, to illustrate my fear, those signs are mild stuff by comparison with the real horror that's at the root of my personality." "I've got images," said Steve. "Pictures from childhood that make me think of—" He stopped, regretting this confessional already. "What?" said Cheryl. "You mean things to do with bad experiences? Falling off your bike or something like that?" "Perhaps," Steve said. I find myself sometimes thinking of those pictures. Not deliberately, just when my concentration's idling. It's almost as though my mind went to them automatically." Quaid gave a little grunt of satisfaction. "Precisely," he said. "Freud writes on that," said Cheryl. "What?" "Freud," Cheryl repeated, this time making a performance of it, as though she were speaking to a child. "Sigmund Freud. You may have heard of him." Quaid's lip curled with unrestrained contempt. "Mother fixations don't answer the problem. The real terrors in me, in all of us, are pre-personality. Dread's there before we have any notion of ourselves as individuals. The thumbnail, curled up on itself in the womb, feels fear." "You remember, do you?" said Cheryl. "Maybe," Quaid replied, deadly serious. "The womb?" Quaid gave a sort of half-smile. Steve thought the smile said, "I have knowledge you don't." It was a weird, unpleasant smile, one Steve wanted to wash off his eyes. "You're a liar," said Cheryl, getting up from her seat and looking down her nose at Quaid. "Perhaps I am," he said, suddenly the perfect gentleman. After that, the debate stopped. No more talking about nightmares, no more debating the things that go bump in the night. Steve saw Quaid irregularly for the next month, and when he did, Quaid was invariably in the company of Cheryl Fromm. Quaid was polite with her, even deferential. He no longer wore his leather jacket, because she hated the smell of dead animal matter. This sudden change in their relationship confounded Stephen, but he put it down to his primitive understanding of sexual matters. He wasn't a virgin, but women were still a mystery to him, contradictory and puzzling. He was also jealous, though he wouldn't entirely admit that to himself. He resented the fact that the wet dream genius was taking up so much of Quaid's time. There was another feeling, a curious sense he had that Quaid was courting Cheryl for his own strange reasons. Sex was not Quaid's motive, he felt sure, nor was it respect for Cheryl's intelligence that made him so attentive. No, he was cornering her somehow. That was Steve's instinct. Cheryl Fromm was being rounded up for the kill. Then, after a month, Quaid let a remark about Cheryl drop in conversation. "She's a vegetarian," he said. "Cheryl?" "Of course, Cheryl." "I know, she mentioned it before." "Yes, but it isn't a fad with her. She's passionate about it. Can't even bear to look at a butcher's window. She won't touch meat, smell meat." "Oh," Steve was stumped. Where was this leading? "Dread, Steve." "Of meat?" "The signs are different from person to person. She fears meat. She says she's so healthy, so balanced. Shit, I'll find it." "Find what?" "The fear, Steve. You're not going to—" Steve didn't know how to voice his anxiety without sounding accusatory. "Harm her," said Quaid. "No, I'm not going to harm her in any way. Any damage done to her will be strictly self-inflicted." Quaid was staring at him almost hypnotically. "It's about time we learned to trust one another," Quaid went on. He leaned closer. "Between the two of us—" "Listen, I don't think I want to hear." "We have to touch the beast, Stephen." "Damn the beast, I don't want to hear." Steve got up, as much to break the opposition of Quaid's stare as to finish the conversation. "We're friends, Stephen." "Yes." "Then respect that." "What?" "Silence. Not a word." Steve nodded. That wasn't a difficult promise to keep. There was nobody he could tell his anxieties to without being laughed at. Quaid looked satisfied. He hurried away, leaving Steve feeling as though he had unwillingly joined some secret society. For what purpose he couldn't begin to tell. Quaid had made a pact with him, and it was unnerving. For the next week he cut all his lectures and most of his seminars. Notes went uncopied, books unread, essays unwritten. On the 2 occasions he actually went into the university building, he crept around like a cautious mouse, praying he wouldn't collide with Quaid. He needn't have feared. The one occasion he did see Quaid's stooping shoulders across the quadrangle, he was involved in a smiling exchange with Cheryl Fromm. She laughed, musically, her pleasure echoing off the wall of the history department. The jealousy had left Steve altogether. He wouldn't have been paid to be so near to Quaid, so intimate with him. The time he spent alone, away from the bustle of lectures and overfull corridors, gave Steve's mind time to idle. His thoughts returned, like tongue to tooth, like fingernail to scab, to his fears, and so to his childhood. At the age of 6, Steve had been struck by a car. The injuries were not particularly bad, but concussion left him partially deaf. It was a profoundly distressing experience for him, not understanding why he was suddenly cut off from the world. It was an inexplicable torment, and the child assumed it was eternal. One moment his life had been real, full of shouts and laughter. The next he was cut off from it, and the external world became an aquarium, full of gaping fish with grotesque smiles. Worse still, there were times when he suffered what the doctors called tinnitus, a roaring or ringing sound in the ears. His head would fill with the most outlandish noises, whoops and whistlings that played like sound effects to the flailings of the outside world. At those times his stomach would churn, and a band of iron would be wrapped around his forehead, crushing his thoughts into fragments, dissociating head from hand, intention from practice. He would be swept away in a tide of panic, completely unable to make sense of the world while his head sang and rattled. But at night came the worst terrors. He would wake sometimes in what had been, before the accident, the reassuring womb of his bedroom, to find the ringing had begun in his sleep. His eyes would jerk open, his body would be wet with sweat, his mind would be filled with the most raucous din, which he was locked in with, beyond hope of reprieve. Nothing could silence his head, and nothing, it seemed, could bring the world, the speaking, laughing, crying world, back to him. He was alone. That was the beginning, middle, and end of the dread. He was absolutely alone with his cacophony, locked in this house, in this room, in this body, in this head, a prisoner of deaf, blind flesh. It was almost unbearable. In the night the boy would sometimes cry out, not knowing he was making any sound, and the fish who had been his parents would turn on the light and come to try and help him, bending over his bed, making faces, their soundless mouths forming ugly shapes in their attempts to help. Their touches would calm him at last. With time, his mother learned the trick of soothing away the panic that swept over him. A week before his 7th birthday, his hearing returned. Not perfectly, but well enough for it to seem like a miracle. The world snapped back into focus, and life began afresh. It took several months for the boy to trust his senses again. He would still wake in the night, half anticipating the head noises. But though his ears would ring at the slightest volume of sound, preventing Steve from going to rock concerts with the rest of the students, he now scarcely ever noticed his slight deafness. He remembered, of course, very well. He could bring back the taste of his panic, the feel of the iron band around his head, and there was a residue of fear there, of the dark, of being alone. But then, wasn't everyone afraid to be alone? To be utterly alone? Steve had another fear now, far more difficult to pin down. Quaid. In a drunken revelation session, he had told Quaid about his childhood, about the deafness, about the night terrors. Quaid knew about his weakness, the clear route into the heart of Steve's dread. He had a weapon, a stick to beat Steve with, should it ever come to that. Maybe that was why he chose not to speak to Cheryl. Warn her, was that what he wanted to do? And certainly that was why he avoided Quaid. The man had a look, in certain moods, of malice. Nothing more or less. He looked like a man with malice deep, deep in him. Maybe those 4 months of watching people with the sound turned down had sensitized Steve to the tiny glances, sneers, and smiles that flit across people's faces. He knew Quaid's life was a labyrinth. A map of its complexities was etched on his face in 1,000 tiny expressions. The next phase of Steve's initiation into Quaid's secret world didn't come for almost 3.5 months. The university broke for the summer recess, and the students went their ways. Steve took his usual vacation job at his father's printing works. It was long hours and physically exhausting, but an undeniable relief for him. Academe had overstuffed his mind. He felt force-fed with words and ideas. The print work sweated all of that out of him rapidly, sorting out the jumble in his mind. It was a good time. He scarcely thought of Quaid at all. He returned to campus in late September. The students were still thin on the ground. Most of the courses didn't start for another week, and there was a melancholy air about the place without its usual melee of complaining, flirting, arguing kids. Steve was in the library, cornering a few important books before others on his course had their hands on them. Books were pure gold at the beginning of term, with reading lists to be checked off, and the university bookshop forever claiming the necessary titles were on order. They would invariably arrive, those vital books, 2 days after the seminar in which the author was to be discussed. This final year, Steve was determined to be ahead of the rush for the few copies of seminal works the library possessed. The familiar voice spoke. "Early to work." Steve looked up to meet Quaid's pinprick eyes. "I'm impressed, Steve." "What with?" "Your enthusiasm for the job." "Oh." Quaid smiled. "What are you looking for?" "Something on Bentham." "I've got Principles of Morals and Legislation. Will that do?" It was a trap. No, that was absurd. He was offering a book. How could that simple gesture be construed as a trap? "Come to think of it," the smile broadened, "I think it's the library copy I've got. I'll give it to you." "Thanks." "Good holiday?" "Yes, thank you. You?" "Very rewarding." The smile had decayed into a thin line beneath his... "You've grown a mustache." It was an unhealthy example of the species. Thin, patchy, and dirty blonde, it wandered back and forth under Quaid's nose as if looking for a way off his face. Quaid looked faintly embarrassed. "Was it for Cheryl?" He was definitely embarrassed now. "Wow, sounds like you had a good vacation." The embarrassment was surmounted by something else. "I've got some wonderful photographs," Quaid said. "What of?" "Holiday snaps." Steve couldn't believe his ears. Had C. Fromm tamed the Quaid? Holiday snaps? "You won't believe some of them." There was something of the Arabs selling dirty postcards about Quaid's manner. What the hell were these photographs? Split beaver shots of Cheryl caught reading Kant? "I don't think of you as being a photographer." It's become a passion of mine." He grinned as he said passion. There was a barely suppressed excitement in his manner. He was positively gleaming with pleasure. "You've got to come and see them. Tonight, and pick up the Bentham at the same time." "Thanks. I've got a house for myself these days, round the corner from the maternity hospital in Pilgrim Street, number 64. Sometime after 9? Right. Thanks. Pilgrim Street." Quaid nodded. "I didn't know there were any habitable houses in Pilgrim Street." "Number 64. Pilgrim Street was on its knees. Most of the houses were already rubble. A few were in the process of being knocked down. Their inside walls were unnaturally exposed. Pink and pale green wallpapers, fireplaces on upper stories hanging over chasms of smoking brick, stairs leading from nowhere to nowhere and back again. Number 64 stood on its own. The houses in the terrace to either side had been demolished and bulldozed away, leaving a desert of impacted brick dust, which a few hardy and foolhardy weeds had tried to populate. A three-legged white dog was patrolling its territory along the side of 64, leaving little piss marks at regular intervals as signs of its ownership. Quaid's house, though scarcely palatial, was more welcoming than the surrounding wasteland. They drank some bad red wine together, which Steve had brought with him, and they smoked some grass. Quaid was far more mellow than Steve had ever seen him before, quite happy to talk trivia instead of dread, laughing occasionally, even telling a dirty joke. The interior of the house was bare to the point of being Spartan. No pictures on the walls, no decoration of any kind. Quaid's books, and there were literally hundreds of them, were piled on the floor in no particular sequence that Steve could make out. The kitchen and bathroom were primitive. The whole atmosphere was almost monastic. After a couple of easy hours, Steve's curiosity got the better of him. "Where's the holiday snaps, then?" he said, aware that he was slurring his words a little and no longer giving a shit. "Oh, yes, my experiment." "Experiment? Tell you the truth, Steve, I'm not so sure I should show them to you." "Why not?" "I'm into serious stuff, Steve." "And I'm not ready for serious stuff, is that what you're saying?" Steve could feel Quaid's technique working on him, even though it was transparently obvious what he was doing. "I didn't say you weren't ready." "What the hell is this stuff?" "Pictures." "Oh? You remember Cheryl?" "Pictures of Cheryl. Huh. How could I forget?" "She won't be coming back this term." "Oh." "She had a revelation." Quaid's stare was basilisk-like. "What do you mean?" "She was always so calm, wasn't she?" Quaid was talking about her as though she were dead. Calm, cool, and collected. "Yes, I suppose she was." "Poor bitch. All she wanted was a good fuck." Steve smirked like a kid at Quaid's dirty talk. It was a little shocking, like seeing Teacher with his dick hanging out of his trousers. "She spent some of the vacation here." "Here? In this house?" "You like her, then?" "She's an ignorant cow. She's pretentious, she's weak, she's stupid. But she wouldn't give a fucking thing." "You mean she wouldn't screw?" "Oh, no, she'd strip off her knickers soon as look at you. It was her fears she wouldn't give." Same old song. But I persuaded her, in the fullness of time. Quaid pulled out a box from behind a pile of philosophy books. In it was a sheaf of black-and-white photographs, blown up to twice postcard size. He passed the first one of the series over to Steve. "I locked her away, you see, Steve." Quaid was as unemotional as a newsreader, to see if I could needle her into showing her dread a little bit. "What do you mean, locked her away?" "Upstairs." Steve felt strange. He could hear his ears singing very quietly. Bad wine always made his head ring. I locked her away upstairs, Quaid said again, as an experiment. That's why I took this house. No neighbors to hear. No neighbors to hear what? Steve looked at the grainy image in his hand. Concealed camera, said Quaid. She never knew I was photographing her. Photograph 1 was of a small, featureless room. A little plain furniture. That's the room, top of the house. Warm. A bit stuffy, even. No noise. No noise. Quaid proffered photograph 2. Same room. Now most of the furniture had been removed. A sleeping bag was laid along one wall. A table, a chair, a bare light bulb. That's how I laid it out for her. It looks like a cell, Quaid grunted. Photograph 3. The same room. On the table, a jug of water. In the corner of the room, a bucket, roughly covered with a towel. What's the bucket for? She had to piss. Yes. All amenities provided, said Quaid. I didn't intend to reduce her to an animal. Even in his drunken state, Steve took Quaid's inference. He didn't intend to reduce her to an animal. However... Photograph 4. On the table, on an unpatterned plate, a slab of meat. A bone sticks out from it. Beef, said Quaid. But she's a vegetarian. So she is. It's slightly salted, well cooked, good beef. Photograph 5. The same. Cheryl is in the room. The door is closed. She is kicking the door, her foot and fist and face a blur of fury. I put her in the room about 5 in the morning. She was sleeping. I carried her over the threshold myself. Very romantic. She didn't know what the hell was going on. You locked her in there? Of course, an experiment. She knew nothing about it? We'd talked about dread, you know me. She knew what I wanted to discover, knew I wanted guinea pigs. She soon caught on. Once she realized what I was up to, she calmed down. Photograph 6. Cheryl sits in the corner of the room, thinking. I think she believed she could outwake me. Photograph 7. Cheryl looks at the leg of beef, glancing at it on the table. Nice photo, don't you think? Look at the expression of disgust on her face. She hated even the smell of cooked meat. She wasn't hungry then, of course. 8. She sleeps. 9. She pisses. Steve felt uncomfortable watching the girl squatting on the bucket, knickers round her ankles, tear stains on her face. 10. She drinks water from the jug. 11. She sleeps again, back to the room, curled up like a fetus. How long has she been in the room? This was only 14 hours in. She lost orientation as to time pretty quickly. No light change, you see. Her body clock was fucked up pretty soon. How long was she in here? Till the point was proved. 12. Awake. She cruises the meat on the table, caught surreptitiously glancing down at it. This was taken the following morning. I was asleep. The camera just took pictures every quarter hour. Look at her eyes. Steve peered more closely at the photograph. There was a certain desperation on Cheryl's face, a haggard, wild look. The way she stared at the beef, she could have been trying to hypnotize it. She looked sick. She's tired, that's all. She slept a lot, as it happened, but it seemed just to make her more exhausted than ever. She doesn't know now if it's day or night, and she's hungry, of course. It's been a day and a half. She's more than a little peckish. 13. She sleeps again, curled into an even tighter ball, as though she wanted to swallow herself. 14. She drinks more water. I replaced the jug when she was asleep. She slept deeply. I could have done a jig in there, and it wouldn't have woken her. Lost to the world. He grinned. Mad, thought Steve. The man's mad. God, it stank in there. You know how women smell sometimes. It's not sweat, it's something else. Heavy odor. Meaty. Bloody. She came on towards the end of her time. Hadn't planned it that way. 15. She touches the meat. This is where the cracks begin to show, said Quaid, with quiet triumph in his voice. This is where the dread begins. Steve studied the photograph closely. The grain of the print blurred the detail, but the cool mama was in pain, that was for sure. Her face was knotted up, half in desire, half in repulsion, as she touched the food. 16. She was at the door again, throwing herself at it, every part of her body flailing, her mouth a black blur of angst, screaming at the blank door. She always ended up haranguing me, whenever she'd have a confrontation with the meat. How long is this? Coming up for 3 days. You're looking at a hungry woman. It wasn't difficult to see that. The next photo, she stood still in the middle of the room, averting her eyes from the temptation of the food, her entire body tensed with the dilemma. You're starving her. She can go 10 days without eating quite easily. Fasts are common in any civilized country, Steve. 60% of the British population is clinically obese at any one time. She was too fat anyhow. 18. She sits, the fat girl, in her corner of the room, weeping. About now she began to hallucinate. Just little mental tics. She thought she felt something in her hair, or on the back of her hand. I'd see her staring into mid-air sometimes, watching nothing. 19. She washes herself. She is stripped to the waist. Her breasts are heavy. Her face is drained of expression. The meat is a darker tone than in the previous photographs. She washed herself regularly. Never let 12 hours go by without washing from head to toe. The meat looks ripe, dark. It's quite warm in her little room, and there's a few flies in there with her. They've found the meat, laid their eggs. Yes, it's ripening up quite nicely. Is that part of the plan? Sure, if the meat revolted when it was fresh. What about her disgust at rotted meat? That's the crux of her dilemma, isn't it? The longer she waits to eat, the more disgusted she becomes with what she's been given to feed on. She's trapped with her own horror of meat on the one hand and her dread of dying on the other. Which is going to give first? Steve was no less trapped now. On the one hand, this joke had already gone too far, and Quaid's experiment had become an exercise in sadism. On the other hand, he wanted to know how far this story ended. There was an undeniable fascination in watching the woman suffer. The next 7 photographs, 20, 21, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, pictured the same circular routine. Sleeping, washing, pissing, meat watching, sleeping, washing, pissing. Then 27. See? She picks up the meat. Yes, she picks it up, her face full of horror. The haunch of the beef looks well ripened now, speckled with flies' eggs. Gross. She bites it. The next photograph, and her face is buried in the meat. Steve seemed to taste the rotten flesh in the back of his throat. His mind found a stench to imagine and created a gravy of putrescence to run over his tongue. How could she do it? 29. She is vomiting in the bucket in the corner of the room. 30. She is sitting looking at the table. It is empty. The water jug has been thrown against the wall. The plate has been smashed. The beef lies on the floor in a slime of degeneration. 31. She sleeps. Her head is lost in a tangle of arms. 32. She is standing up. She is looking at the meat again, defying it. The hunger she feels is plain on her face. So is the disgust. 33. She sleeps. "How long now?" asked Steve. 5 days. No, 6. 6 days. 34. She is a blurred figure, apparently flinging herself against a wall, perhaps beating her head against it. Steve couldn't be sure. He was past asking. Part of him didn't want to know. 35. She is again sleeping, this time beneath the table. The sleeping bag has been torn to pieces, shredded cloth and pieces of stuffing littering the room. 36. She speaks to the door, through the door, knowing she will get no answer. 37. She eats the rancid meat. Calmly, she sits under the table, like a primitive in her cave, and pulls at the meat with her incisors. Her face is again expressionless. All her energy is bent to the purpose of the moment. To eat till the hunger disappears, till the agony in her belly and the sickness in her head disappear. Steve stared at the photograph. "It startled me," said Quaid, "how suddenly she gave in. One moment she seemed to have as much resistance as ever. The monologue at the door was the same mixture of threats and apologies as she delivered day in, day out. Then she broke, just like that, squatted under the table and ate the beef down to the bone, as though it were a choice cut. 38. She sleeps. The door is open. Light pours in. 39. The room is empty. Where did she go? She wandered downstairs. She came into the kitchen, drank several glasses of water, and sat in a chair for 3 or 4 hours without saying a word. Did you speak to her? Eventually, when she started to come out of her fugue state. The experiment was over. I didn't want to hurt her. What did she say? Nothing. Nothing. Nothing at all. For a long time I don't believe she was even aware of my presence in the room. Then I cooked some potatoes, which she ate. She didn't try and call the police? No. No violence? No. She knew what I'd done and why I'd done it. It wasn't pre-planned, but we'd talked about such experiments in abstract conversations. She hadn't come to any harm, you see. She'd lost a bit of weight, perhaps, but that was about all. Where is she now? She left the day after. I don't know where she went. And what did it all prove? Nothing at all, perhaps, but it made an interesting start to my investigations. Start? This was only a start. There was plain disgust for Quaid in Steve's voice. Stephen, you could have killed her. No. She could have lost her mind, unbalanced her permanently. Possibly, but unlikely. She was a strong-willed woman. But you broke her. Yes, it was a journey she was ready to take. We'd talked of going to face her fear. So here was I, arranging for Cheryl to do just that. Nothing much, really. You forced her to do it. She wouldn't have gone otherwise. True, it was an education for her. So now you're a teacher. Steve wished he'd been able to keep the sarcasm out of his voice, but it was there. Sarcasm, anger, and a little fear. Yes, I'm a teacher, Quaid replied, looking at Steve obliquely, his eyes not focused. I'm teaching people dread. Steve stared at the floor. Are you satisfied with what you've taught? And learned, Steve. I've learned, too. It's a very exciting prospect, a world of fears to investigate, especially with intelligent subjects, even in the face of rationalization. Steve stood up. I don't want to hear any more. Oh? Okay. I've got classes early tomorrow. No. What? A beat, faltering. No, don't go yet. Why? His heart was racing. He feared Quaid. He'd never realized how profoundly. I've got some more books to give you. Steve felt his face flush, slightly. What had he thought in that moment? That Quaid was going to bring him down with a rugby tackle and start experimenting on his fears? No, idiot thoughts. "I've got a book on Kierkegaard you'll like. Upstairs. I'll be 2 minutes." Smiling, Quaid left the room. Steve squatted on his haunches and began to sheaf through the photographs again. It was the moment when Cheryl first picked up the rotting meat that fascinated him most. Her face wore an expression completely uncharacteristic of the woman he had known. Doubt was written there, and confusion, and deep dread. It was Quaid's word, a dirty word, an obscene word associated from this night on with Quaid's torture of an innocent girl. For a moment Steve thought of the expression on his own face as he stared down at the photograph. Was there not some of the same confusion on his face, and perhaps some of the dread, too, waiting for release? He heard a sound behind him, too soft to be Quaid, unless he was creeping. Oh, God, unless he was... A pad of chloroformed cloth was clamped over Steve's mouth and his nostrils. Involuntarily he inhaled, and the vapors stung his sinuses, made his eyes water. A blob of blackness appeared at the corner of the world, just out of sight, and it started to grow, this stain, pulsing to the rhythm of his quickening heart. In the center of Steve's head he could see Quaid's voice as a veil. It said his name. Stephen. Again. Even. The stain was the world. The world was dark, gone away, out of sight, out of mind. Steve fell clumsily amongst the photographs. When he woke up, he was unaware of his consciousness. There was darkness everywhere, on all sides. He lay awake for an hour with his eyes wide before he realized they were open. Experimentally, he moved first his arms and his legs, then his head. He wasn't bound, as he'd expected, except by his ankle. There was definitely a chain, or something similar, around his left ankle. It chafed his skin when he tried to move too far. The floor beneath him was very uncomfortable, and when he investigated it more closely with the palm of his hand, he realized he was lying on a huge grill or grid of some kind. It was metal, and its regular surface spread in every direction as far as his arms would reach. When he poked his arm down through the holes in this lattice, he touched nothing, just empty air falling away beneath him. The first infrared photographs Quaid took of Stephen's confinement pictured his exploration. As Quaid had expected, the subject was being quite rational about his situation. No hysterics, no curses, no tears. That was the challenge of this particular subject. He knew precisely what was going on, and he would respond logically to his fears. That would surely make a more difficult mind to break than Cheryl's. But how much more rewarding the results would be when he did crack. Would his soul not open up then for Quaid to see and touch? There was so much there, in the man's interior, he wanted to study. Gradually Steve's eyes became accustomed to the darkness. He was imprisoned in what appeared to be some kind of shaft. It was, he estimated, about 20 feet wide and completely round. Was it some kind of air shaft for a tunnel or an underground factory? Steve's mind mapped the area around Pilgrim Street, trying to pinpoint the most likely place for Quaid to have taken him. He could think of nowhere. Nowhere. He was lost in a place he couldn't fix or recognize. The shaft had no corners to focus his eyes on, and the walls offered no crack or hole to hide his consciousness in. Worse, he was lying spread-eagled on a grid that hung over this shaft. His eyes could make no impression on the darkness beneath him. It seemed that the shaft might be bottomless, and there was only the thin network of the grill and the fragile chain that shackled his ankle to it between him and falling. He pictured himself poised under an empty black sky and over an infinite darkness. The air was warm and stale. It dried up the tears that had suddenly sprung to his eyes, leaving them gummy. When he began to shout for help, which he did after the tears had passed, the darkness ate his words easily. Having yelled himself hoarse, he lay back on the lattice. He couldn't help but imagine that beyond his frail bed the darkness went on forever. It was absurd, of course. Nothing goes on forever, he said aloud. Nothing goes on forever. And yet he'd never know. If he fell in the absolute blackness beneath him, he'd fall and fall and fall and not see the bottom of the shaft coming. Though he tried to think of brighter, more positive images, his mind conjured his body cascading down this horrible shaft, with the bottom a foot from his hurtling body, and his eyes not seeing it, his brain not predicting it. Until he hit. Would he see light as his head was dashed open on impact? Would he understand, in the moment that his body became awful, why he'd lived and died? Then he thought, Quade wouldn't dare. "Wouldn't dare!" he screeched. "Wouldn't dare!" The dark was a glutton for words. As soon as he'd yelled into it, it was as though he'd never made a sound. And then another thought, a real baddie. Suppose Quade had found this circular hell to put him in because it would never be found. Never be investigated. Maybe he wanted to take his experiment to the limits. To the limits? Death was at the limits, and wouldn't that be the ultimate experiment for Quade? Watching a man die, watching the fear of death, the motherlode of dread, approach. Sartre had written that no man could ever know his own death. But to know the deaths of others intimately, to watch the acrobatics that the mind would surely perform to avoid the bitter truth, that was a clue to death's nature, wasn't it? That might in some small way prepare a man for his own death. To live another's dread vicariously was the safest, cleverest way to touch the beast. Yes, he thought, Quade might kill me, out of his own terror. Steve took a sour satisfaction in that thought, that Quade, the impartial experimenter, the would-be educator, was obsessed with terrors because his own dread ran deepest. That was why he had to watch others deal with their fears. He needed a solution, a way out for himself. Thinking all this through took hours. In the darkness, Steve's mind was quicksilver, but uncontrollable. He found it difficult to keep one train of argument for very long. His thoughts were like fish, small, fast fish, wriggling out of his grasp as soon as he took a hold of them. But underlying every twist of thought was the knowledge that he must outplay Quade. That was certain. He must be calm, prove himself a useless subject for Quade's analysis. The photographs of these hours showed Stephen lying with his eyes closed on the grid, with a slight frown on his face. Occasionally, paradoxically, a smile would flit across his lips. Sometimes it was impossible to know if he was sleeping or waking, thinking or dreaming. Quade waited. Eventually, Steve's eyes began to flicker under his lids, the unmistakable sign of dreaming. It was time, while the subject slept, to turn the wheel of the rack. Steve woke with his hands cuffed together. He could see a bowl of water on a plate beside him, and a second bowl full of lukewarm, unsalted porridge beside it. He ate and drank thankfully. As he ate, two things registered. First, that the noise of his eating seemed very loud in his head, and second, that he felt a constriction, a tightness around his temples. The photograph shows Stephen clumsily reaching up to his head. A harness is strapped onto him and locked in place. It clamps plugs deep into his ears, preventing any sound from getting in. The photographs show puzzlement, then anger, then fear. Steve was deaf. All he could hear were the noises in his head, the clicking of his teeth, the slush and swallow of his palate. The sounds boomed between his ears like guns. Tears sprang to his eyes. He kicked at the grid, not hearing the clatter of his heels on the metal bars. He screamed until his throat felt as if it were bleeding. He heard none of his cries. Panic began in him. The photograph showed its birth. His face was flushed, his eyes were wide, his teeth and gums exposed in a grimace. He looked like a frightened monkey. All the familiar childhood feelings swept over him. He remembered them like the faces of old enemies, the chittering limbs, the sweat, the nausea. In desperation, he picked up the bowl of water and upturned it over his face. The shock of the cold water diverted his mind momentarily from the panic ladder it was climbing. He lay back down on the grid, his body aboard, and told himself to breathe deeply and evenly. "Relax, relax, relax," he said aloud. In his head he could hear his tongue clicking. He could hear his mucus, too, moving sluggishly in the panic-constricted passages of his nose, blocking and unblocking in his ears. Now he could detect the low, soft hiss that waited under all the other noises, the sound of his mind. It was like the white noise between stations on the radio. This was the same whine that came to fetch him under anesthetic, the same noise that would sound in his ears on the borders of sleep. His limbs still twitched nervously, and he was only half aware of the way he wrestled with his handcuffs, indifferent to their edges, scouring the skin at his wrists. The photographs recorded all these reactions precisely. His war with hysteria, his pathetic attempts to keep the fears from resurfacing, his tears, his bloody wrists. Eventually, exhaustion won over panic, as it had so often as a child. How many times had he fallen asleep with the salt taste of tears in his nose and mouth, unable to fight any longer? The exertion had heightened the pitch of his head noises. Now, instead of a lullaby, his brain whistled and whooped him to sleep. Oblivion was good. Quaid was disappointed. It was clear from the speed of his response that Stephen Grace was going to break very soon indeed. In fact, he was as good as broken, only a few hours into the experiment. And Quaid had been relying on Stephen. After months of preparing the ground, it seemed that this subject was going to lose his mind without giving up a single clue. One word, one miserable word was all Quaid needed. A little sign as to the nature of the experience, or better still, something to suggest a solution, a healing totem, a prayer even. Surely some savior comes to the lips, as the personality is swept away in madness. There must be something. Quaid waited like a carrion bird at the sight of some atrocity, counting the minutes left to the expiring soul, hoping for a morsel. Steve woke face down on the grid. The air was much staler now, and the metal bars bit into the flesh of his cheek. He was hot and uncomfortable. He lay still, letting his eyes become accustomed to his surroundings again. The lines of the grid ran off in perfect perspective to meet the wall of the shaft. The simple network of crisscrossed bars struck him as pretty. Yes, pretty. He traced the lines back and forth till he tired of the game. Bored, he rolled over onto his back, feeling the grid vibrate under his body. Was it less stable now? It seemed to rock a little as he moved. Hot and sweaty, Steve unbuttoned his shirt. There was sleep spittle on his chin, but he didn't care to wipe it off. What if he drooled? Who was to see? He half pulled off his shirt, and using one foot, kicked his shoe off the other. Shoe, lattice, fall. Sluggishly his mind made the connection. He sat up. Oh, poor shoe. His shoe would fall. It would slip between the bars and be lost. But no. It was finely balanced across two sides of a lattice hole. He could still save it if he tried. He reached for his poor shoe, and his movement shifted the grid. The shoe began to slip. "Please," he begged it, "don't fall." He didn't want to lose his nice shoe, his pretty shoe. It mustn't fall. It mustn't fall. As he stretched to snatch it, the shoe tipped heel down, through the grid, and fell into the darkness. He let out a cry of loss that he couldn't hear. Oh, if only he could listen to the shoe falling, to count the seconds of its descent, to hear it thud home at the bottom of the shaft. At least then he'd know how far he had to fall to his death. He couldn't endure it any longer. He rolled over onto his stomach and thrust both arms through the grid, screaming, "I'll go too! I'll go too!" He couldn't bear waiting to fall, in the dark, in the whining silence. He just wanted to follow his shoe down, down, down the dark shaft to extinction, and to have the whole game finished once and for all. "I'll go! I'll go! I'll go!" he shrieked. He pleaded with gravity. Beneath him, the grid moved. Something had broken. A pin, a chain, a rope that held the grid in position had snapped. He was no longer horizontal. Already he was sliding across the bars as they tipped him off into the dark. With shock, he realized his limbs were no longer chained. He would fall. The man wanted him to fall. The bad man. What was his name? Quake? Quail? Quarrel? Automatically he seized the grid with both hands as it tipped even further over. Maybe he didn't want to fall after his shoe, after all. Maybe life, a little movement more of life, was worth holding on to. The dark beyond the edge of the grid was so deep, and who could guess what lurked in it? In his head, the noises of his panic multiplied. The thumping of his bloody heart, the stutter of his mucus, the dry rasp of his palate. His palms, slick with sweat, were losing their grip. Gravity wanted him. It demanded its rights of his body's bulk, demanded that he fall. For a moment, glancing over his shoulder at the mouth that opened under him, he thought he saw monsters stirring below him. Ridiculous, loony things, crudely drawn, dark on dark. Vile graffiti leered up from his childhood and uncurled their claws to snatch at his legs. "Mama," he said, as his hands failed him and he was delivered into dread. "Mama!" That was the word. Quade heard it plainly, in all its banality. "Mama!" By the time Steve hit the bottom of the shaft, he was past judging how far he'd fallen. The moment his hands let go of the grid and he knew the dark would have him, his mind snapped. The animal self survived to relax his body, saving him all but minor injury on impact. The rest of his life, all but the simplest responses, were shattered, the pieces flung into the recesses of his memory. When the light came at last, he looked up at the person in the Mickey Mouse mask at the door and smiled at him. It was a child's smile, one of thankfulness for his comical rescuer. He let the man take him by the ankles and haul him out of the big round room in which he was lying. His pants were wet, and he knew he'd dirtied himself in his sleep. Still, the funny mouse would kiss him better. His head lolled on his shoulders as he was dragged out of the torture chamber. On the floor beside his head was a shoe, and 7 or 8 feet above him was the grid from which he had fallen. It meant nothing at all. He let the mouse sit him down in a bright room. He let the mouse give him his ears back, though he didn't really want them. It was funny watching the world without sound. It made him laugh. He drank some water and ate some sweet cake. He was tired. He wanted to sleep. He wanted his mamma, but the mouse didn't seem to understand. So he cried and kicked the table and threw the plates and cups on the floor. Then he ran into the next room and threw all the papers he could find in the air. It was nice watching them flutter up and flutter down. Some of them fell face down, some face up. Some were covered with writing, some were pictures, horrid pictures, pictures that made him feel very strange. They were all pictures of dead people, every one of them. Some of the pictures were of little children, others were of grown-up children. They were lying down or half sitting, and there were big cuts in their faces and their bodies, cuts that showed a mess underneath, a mishmash of shiny bits and doozy bits, and all around the dead people black paint, not in neat puddles, but splashed all around, and finger-marked, and hand-printed, and very messy. In 3 or 4 of the pictures, the thing that made the cuts was still there. He knew the word for it. Axe. There was an axe in a lady's face, buried almost to the handle. There was an axe in a man's leg, and another lying on the floor of the kitchen beside a dead baby. This man collected pictures of dead people and axes, which Stevie thought was strange. That was his last thought before the too familiar scent of chloroform filled his head, and he lost consciousness. The sordid doorway smelt of old urine and fresh vomit. It was his own vomit. It was all over the front of his shirt. He tried to stand up, but his legs felt wobbly. It was very cold. His throat hurt. Then he heard footsteps. It sounded like the mouse was coming back. Maybe he'd take him home. "Get up, son." It wasn't the mouse. It was a policeman. "What are you doing down there?" "I said get up." Bracing himself against the crumbling brick of the doorway, Steve got to his feet. The policeman shone his torch at him. "Jesus Christ," said the policeman, disgust written over his face. "You're in a right fucking state. Where do you live?" Steve shook his head, staring down at his vomit-soaked shirt like a shamed schoolboy. "What's your name?" He couldn't quite remember. "Name, lad." He was trying. If only the policeman wouldn't shout. "Come on, take a hold of yourself." The words didn't make much sense. Steve could feel tears pricking the backs of his eyes. "Home." Now he was blubbering, sniffing snot, feeling utterly forsaken. He wanted to die. He wanted to lie down and die. The policeman shook him. "You high on something?" he demanded, pulling Steve into the glare of the streetlights and staring at his tear-stained face. "You'd better move on." "Mama," said Steve. "I want my mama." The words changed the encounter entirely. Suddenly the policeman found the spectacle more than disgusting, more than pitiful. This little bastard, with his bloodshot eyes and his dinner down his shirt, was really getting on his nerves. Too much money, too much dirt in his veins, too little discipline. Mama was the last straw. He punched Steve in the stomach, a neat, sharp, functional blow. Steve doubled up, whimpering. "Shut up, son." Another blow finished the job of crippling the child, and then he took a fistful of Steve's hair and pulled the little druggie's face up to meet his. "You want to be a derelict, is that it?" "No, no." Steve didn't know what a derelict was. He just wanted to make the policeman like him. "Please," he said, tears coming again, "take me home." The policeman seemed confused. The kid hadn't started fighting back and calling for civil rights the way most of them did. That was the way they usually ended up, on the ground, bloody-nosed, calling for a social worker. This one just wept. The policeman began to get a bad feeling about the kid, like he was mental or something. And he'd beaten the shit out of the little snot. Fuck it. Now he felt responsible. He took hold of Steve by the arm and bundled him across the road to his car. "Get in." "Take me—" "I'll take you home, son. I'll take you home." At the night hostel, they searched Steve's clothes for some kind of identification, found none, then scoured his body for fleas, his hair for nits. The policeman left him then, which Steve was relieved about. He hadn't liked the man. The people at the hostel talked about him as though he wasn't in the room, talked about how young he was, discussed his mental age, his clothes, his appearance. Then they gave him a bar of soap and showed him the showers. He stood under the cold water for 10 minutes and dried himself with a stained towel. He didn't shave. Though they'd lent him a razor, he'd forgotten how to do it. Then they gave him some old clothes, which he liked. They weren't such bad people, even if they did talk about him as though he wasn't there. One of them even smiled at him, a burly man with a grizzled beard, smiled as he would at a dog. They were odd clothes he was given, either too big or too small, all colors, yellow socks, dirty white shirt, pinstripe trousers that had been made for a glutton, a threadbare sweater, heavy boots. He liked dressing up, putting on 2 vests and 2 pairs of socks when they weren't looking. He felt assured, with several thicknesses of cotton and wool wrapped around him. Then they left him with a ticket for his bed in his hand, to wait for the dormitories to be unlocked. He was not impatient, like some of the men in the corridors with him. They yelled incoherently, many of them, their accusations laced with obscenities, and they spat at each other. It frightened him. All he wanted was to sleep, to lie down and sleep. At 11 o'clock, one of the warders unlocked the gate to the dormitory, and all the lost men filed through to find themselves an iron bed for the night. The dormitory, which was large and badly lit, stank of disinfectant and old people. Avoiding the eyes and the flailing arms of the other derelicts, Steve found himself in an ill-made bed with one thin blanket tossed across it, and lay down to sleep. All around him men were coughing and muttering and weeping. One was saying his prayers as he lay, staring at the ceiling, on his gray pillow. Steve thought that was a good idea, so he said his own child's prayer. "Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, look upon this little child, pity my—" What was the word? "Pity my simplicity. Suffer me to come to thee." That made him feel better. And the sleep, a balm, was blue and deep. Quaid sat in darkness. The terror was on him again, worse than ever. His body was rigid with fear, so much so that he couldn't even get out of bed and snap on the light. Besides, what if this time of all times, the terror was true? What if the Axeman was at the door in flesh and blood, grinning like a loon at him, dancing like the devil at the top of the stairs, as Quaid had seen him in dreams, dancing and grinning, grinning and dancing? Nothing moved. No creak of the stair, no giggle in the shadows. It wasn't him, after all. Quaid would live till morning. His body had relaxed a little now. He swung his legs out of bed and switched on the light. The room was indeed empty. The house was silent. Through the open door he could see the top of the stairs. There was no Axeman, of course. Steve woke to shouting. It was still dark. He didn't know how long he'd been asleep, but his limbs no longer ached so badly. Elbows on his pillow, he half sat up and stared down the dormitory to see what all the commotion was about. 4 bedrows down from his, 2 men were fighting. The bone of contention was by no means clear. They just grappled with each other like girls. It made Steve laugh to watch them, screeching and pulling each other's hair. By moonlight, the blood on their faces and hands was black. One of them, the older of the 2, was thrust back across his bed, screaming, "I will not go to the Finchley Road. You will not make me. Don't strike me. I'm not your man. I'm not." The other was beyond listening. He was too stupid, or too mad, to understand that the old man was begging to be left alone. Urged on by spectators on every side, the old man's assailant had taken off his shoe and was belaboring his victim with it. Steve could hear the crack, crack of his blows, heel on head. There were cheers accompanying each strike, and lessening cries from the old man. Suddenly the applause faltered as somebody came into the dormitory. Steve couldn't see who it was. The mass of men crowded around the fight were between him and the door. He did see the victor toss his shoe into the air, however, with a final shout of "Fucker!" The shoe. Steve couldn't take his eyes off the shoe. It rose in the air, turning as it rose, then plummeted to the bare boards like a shot bird. Steve saw it clearly, more clearly than he'd seen anything in many days. It landed not far from him. It landed with a loud thud. It landed on its side, as his shoe had landed. His shoe. The one he kicked off, on the grid, in the room, in the house, in Pilgrim Street. Quaid woke with the same dream. Always the stairway. Always him looking down the tunnel of the stairs, while that ridiculous sight, half joke, half horror, tiptoed up towards him, a laugh on every step. He'd never dreamt twice in one night before. He swung his hand out over the edge of the bed and fumbled for the bottle he kept there. In the dark he swigged from it, deeply. Steve walked past the knot of angry men, not caring about their shouts or the old man's groans and curses. The warders were having a hard time dealing with the disturbance. It was the last time old man Crowley would be let in. He always invited violence. This had all the marks of a near riot. It would take hours to settle them down again. Nobody questioned Steve as he wandered down the corridor, through the gate and into the vestibule of the night hostel. The swing doors were closed, but the night air, bitter before dawn, smelt refreshing as it seeped in. The poky reception office was empty, and through the doors Steve could see the fire extinguisher hanging on the wall. It was red and bright. Beside it was a long black hose, curled up on a red drum like a sleeping snake. Beside that, sitting in 2 brackets on the wall, was an axe. A very pretty axe. Stephen walked into the office. A little distance away he heard running feet, shouts, a whistle, but nobody came to interrupt Steve. as he made friends with the axe. First he smiled at it. The curve of the blade of the axe smiled back. Then he touched it. The axe seemed to like being touched. It was dusty and hadn't been used in a long while. Too long. It wanted to be picked up and stroked and smiled at. Steve took it out of its brackets very gently and slid it under his jacket to keep warm. Then he walked back out of the reception office, through the swing doors, and out to find his other shoe. Quaid woke again. It took Steve a very short time to orient himself. There was a spring in his step as he began to make his way to Pilgrim Street. He felt like a clown, dressed in so many bright colors, in such floppy trousers, such silly boots. He was a comical fellow, wasn't he? He made himself laugh, he was so comical. The wind began to get into him, whipping him up into a frenzy as it scooted through his hair and made his eyeballs as cold as 2 lumps of ice in his sockets. He began to run, skip, dance, cavort through the streets, white under the lights, dark in between. Now you see me, now you don't. Now you see me, now you... Quaid hadn't been woken by the dream this time. This time he had heard a noise. Definitely a noise. The moon had risen high enough to throw its beams through the window, through the door and on to the top of the stairs. There was no need to put on the light. All he needed to see, he could see. The top of the stairs were empty, as ever. Then the bottom stair creaked. A tiny noise as though a breath had landed on it. Quaid knew dread then. Another creak as it came up the stairs towards him, the ridiculous dream. It had to be a dream. After all, he knew no clowns, no axe-killers. So how could that absurd image, the same image that woke him night after night, be anything but a dream? Yet perhaps there were some dreams so preposterous they could only be true. No clowns, he said to himself, as he stood watching the door, and the stairway, and the spotlight of the moon. Quaid knew only fragile minds, so weak they couldn't give him a clue to the nature, to the origin, or to the cure for the panic that now held him in thrall. All they did was break, crumble into dust, when faced with the slightest sign of the dread at the heart of life. He knew no clowns, never had, never would. Then it appeared, the face of a fool, pale to whiteness in the light of the moon, its young features bruised, unshaven and puffy, its smile open like a child's smile. It had bitten its lip in its excitement. Blood was smeared across its lower jaw, and its gums were almost black with blood. Still, it was a clown. Indisputably a clown, even to its ill-fitting clothes, so incongruous, so pathetic. Only the axe didn't quite match the smile. It caught the moonlight as the maniac made small, chopping motions with it, his tiny black eyes glinting with anticipation of the fun ahead. Almost at the top of the stairs he stopped, his smile not faltering for a moment as he gazed at Quaid's terror. Quaid's legs gave out, and he stumbled to his knees. The clown climbed another stair, skipping as he did so, his glittering eyes fixed on Quaid, filled with a sort of benign malice. The axe rocked back and forth in his white hands in a petite version of the killing stroke. Quaid knew him. It was his pupil, his guinea pig, transformed into the image of his own dread. Him, of all men, him, the deaf boy. The skipping was bigger now, and the clown was making a deep-throated noise, like the call of some fantastical bird. The axe was describing wider and wider sweeps in the air, each more lethal than the last. "Stephen," said Quaid. The name meant nothing to Steve. All he saw was the mouth opening, the mouth closing. Perhaps a sound came out, perhaps not. It was irrelevant to him. The throat of the clown gave out a screech, and the axe swung up over his head two-handed. At the same moment, the merry little dance became a run as the axeman leapt the last two stairs and ran into the bedroom, full into the spotlight. Quade's body half turned to avoid the killing blow, but not quickly or elegantly enough. The blade slit the air and sliced through the back of Quade's arm, shearing off most of his triceps, shattering his humerus and opening the flesh of his lower arm in a gash that just missed his artery. Quade's scream could have been heard 10 houses away, except that those houses were rubble. There was nobody to hear, nobody to come and drag the clown off him. The axe, eager to be about its business, was hacking at Quade's thigh now, as though it was chopping a log. Yawning wounds 4 or 5 inches deep exposed the shiny steak of a philosopher's muscle, the bone, the marrow. With each stroke, the clown would tug at the axe to pull it out, and Quade's body would jerk like a puppet. Quade screamed. Quade begged. Quade cajoled. The clown didn't hear a word. All he heard was the noise in his head, the whistles, the whoops, the howls, the hums. He had taken refuge where no rational argument, no threat would ever fetch him out again, where the thump of his heart was law and the whine of his blood was music. How he danced, this deaf boy, danced like a loon to see his tormentor gaping like a fish, the depravity of his intellect silenced forever. How the blood spurted, how it gushed and fountained. The little clown laughed to see such fun. There was a night's entertainment to be had here, he thought. The axe was his friend forever, keen and wise. It would cut and cross-cut. It could slice and amputate. Yet still they could keep this man alive if they were cunning enough, alive for a long, long while. Steve was happy as a lamb. They had the rest of the night ahead of them, and all the music he could possibly want was sounding in his head. And Quade knew, meeting the clown's vacant stare through an air turned bloody, that there was worse in the world than dread, worse than death itself. There was pain without hope of healing. There was life that refused to end, long after the mind had begged the body to cease. And worst, there were dreams come true.